Hi, I'm Jack Baker, and this presentation is going to provide an overview of a numerical procedure for fragility function fitting using a structural analysis data of the type that we call data resulting from multiple stripes analysis. This particular procedure is outlined in more detail in the journal paper that's noted below here on the slide. Additional details regarding the procedure is provided in that paper. There is also some spreadsheet and MATLAB tools provided that I will provide a brief overview of here as well. So let's talk a little bit about the problem being discussed here. So the problem we're thinking about is relates to fragility functions. So fragility functions, as outlined, for instance, up top in this equation, is providing the probability of, the probability of collapse of a structure. So I'll denote that C. I'll talk about collapse here, but you could imagine extending this exact procedure to other limit states as well besides collapse. But I'll talk about collapse here. So I want to talk about the probability of collapse given a ground motion that has some intensity measure. I'll denote Im that's equal to some amplitude denoted small x. So if we come over to the plot at the right, if I have an Im value of 1, I want to know what's the probability of collapse of my structure. And this Im, so I'll still spell that out here, it's an intensity measure. That could be any measure of ground motion intensity. We could think about peak ground velocities or peak ground accelerations or spectral accelerations or your favorite other intensity measure. Here I'm going to keep it generic just to illustrate the generality of the procedure. I've put numerical values here, and you can imagine kind of any sort of intensity measure and numerical values being that x-axis. Okay, so the typical way that we quantify these fragility functions is with a log normal cumulative distribution function. So this capital phi here is a normal distribution, cumulative distribution function. And then because there's a logarithm inside of this operation, when I'm taking the log of x and putting it into this normal cumulative distribution function, I'm using essentially a log normal distribution to characterize these probabilities as a function of Im. Okay, so I have x is the intensity level that I have specified when I want to compute this probability of collapse, and then theta and beta are two parameters. So I noted down below here we say parameter estimation. So theta and beta are constants, or we're going to call them parameters, that define this fragility function. And just by looking at that functional form, I can see that if theta takes a bigger value, then x would have to take a correspondingly bigger value for the argument of this function to be the same, to have the same probability of collapse. So as theta gets bigger, I need bigger values of x to have the same probability of collapse. So I'm shifting my function back and forth with that theta parameter, left and right in the figure. And then beta is quantifying the steepness of this, this fragility function. Okay? And the question that we want to think about here today is, how do I estimate the values of theta and beta for a given structure if I have performed some structural analysis and observed collapses and non-collapses? How do I turn those observations into estimates of theta and beta, the parameters that I need to estimate here? Okay, so when we've done these fragility function fittings for many years using incremental dynamic analysis. So I've got the fragility function listed up top here for reference. The incremental dynamic analysis is performed kind of as illustrated in this upper right figure. So each one of these lines is a given ground motion, and I'm going to scale my ground motion up and up and up, so to increasing Im levels on that y-axis. And for each level of scaling that I apply to that ground motion, I'm going to input it into a structure and find the corresponding maximum story drift ratio, say in this figure here. At some point, my maximum story drift ratios are going to get larger and larger, and I'll actually get a dynamic instability in my model, my structural model, if the model is capable of modeling all the way up to collapse. And I will get one observation of the Im level at which I observe a collapse. And so we have kind of a number of circles up the right-hand side of this upper right figure indicating the Im values associated with collapse. Okay? If I have data of this type, all I have to do to fit a fragility function is compute the mean and the standard deviation of the log of those IM values, and that gives me exactly the parameters for a fragility function. So the math is kind of noted down below, and then the lower right figure is a plot of kind of those same circle values, the IM values are plotted now along the x-axis, and these circles, the y-axis value is the fraction of the ground motions that have caused collapse by that IM level. So we can kind of plot those up in what's called an empirical cumulative distribution. And then the fragility function with the theta and beta values estimated as noted over on the left are then is also plotted here, and we can see the reasonable visual agreement. One note about notation here as well before we move on is that down in the lower right, I'm using my data, these IMI values, which are the IM values associated with these heavy circles in the figures, and I'm processing them up to get an estimate of theta, but I know that my estimate is not the actual value of theta because I have a finite sample of data, and that data has some variability to it. I know I don't have exactly theta, I have an estimate of theta. So what I will do is I'll put a little hat over the top of that variable to denote that I've got an estimate of theta. And similarly for the beta, I've got a hat up there. Okay? So that's a common notation in the parameter estimation literature and statistics. Okay, so that's incremental dynamic analysis data. The focus of the presentation here is going to be, what if we do our structural analysis in a slightly different way? So this figure here has the same axes limits as the previous figure, but now we're performing what we call sometimes multiple stripe analysis. And so what's done is at a particular IM level, a number of ground motions are selected. Each of those selected and potentially scaled, or these ground motions can be simulated wherever you get them from. They have the specified IM level, and each one of them we perform a structural analysis and get these peak story drift ratios again. And maybe some of these ground motions are also causing a collapse, and so those are noted over here on the right, just kind of stacked up horizontally so that you can see how many are over there on the right. So this procedure is a little bit different than the incremental dynamic analysis in that I'm only going to do a fixed set of IM levels. I may not go all the way up to high IM levels that produce 100% of collapses in my structure. I also might use different ground motions at each IM level. In modern record selection thinking, that says, well, why don't we get representative ground motions associated with each level of intensity, and low intensity ground motions that look different than high intensity ground motions, so let's use different ground motions at those, rather than just taking a single ground motion and scaling it up and down across all intensities. Okay? So that has a couple implications. So I don't have an IM at collapse for every ground motion. I might use a ground motion only one time at a single IM level, and it either caused a collapse or it didn't. So my data that I'm getting is kind of fundamentally different. I might not get increasing fractions of collapse with increasing IM, although I think my real structure has an increasing likelihood of collapse with increasing IM, because I'm using finite numbers of ground motions and I'm potentially using different ground motions at each level. That may not be 100% of the time the case. And so you can see for this example data, there's two IM levels. One of the higher of the two actually has a little bit fewer collapses. You can also see it in this lower right plot where I've plotted the fractions of collapses from the data above. And we see that the lower IM level actually has a slightly higher per fraction of analyses causing collapse. That's kind of a it's an expected artifact, but it adds a little bit of a complication to our fitting procedure potentially. So that's our second complicating factor. And then the third complicating factor is I may not want to run analyses all the way up at extremely high IM levels. Those high IM levels don't have a lot of practical implications. They're typically extremely rare. We don't necessarily have observational data at those high IM levels. And further, those high IM levels are not typically the big contributors to collapse risk in a structure as well. So for lots of reasons, we may not want to spend time and effort performing analysis up there. But what it means is that when I look at my data down below, in this lower figure, I might have fractions of collapses of 0, 0, 0 at the low IM levels, 10, 20%, up to say 40% or so. And I might not have any IM levels at which I saw more than 50% collapses. And so that's, again, it just means that we need to do a little more thinking about how to fit a fragility function to this type of data. Okay, so our questions are, how do we fit a fragility function to this type of data? And then the second question is, once I've got a procedure to do this fitting, how can I be effective in performing my structural analysis? How can I be efficient in identifying the analysis strategy so that I don't waste my time doing a lot of structural analyses that aren't providing good constraints on the fragility function. So today in this presentation, I'm going to give you a few slides about question number 1, how to do the fitting. And then question number 2, if you're interested in that, you need to go read that paper that's mentioned on page 1. So there's some details in there, but I wanted to spend time talking about that in this video. Okay, so the procedure we're going to use here is what's called maximum likelihood. So what we want to do is we want to think about, let's talk about our data and what we're trying to do. So my data is, at each of these IM levels, we can think about the hypothetical data indicated by those triangles. I've got an IM level, I performed some number of analyses, so I have some number of ground motions, that's my denominator. And then of those ground motions, some number of them caused a collapse. Okay? That's my numerator. So in this case, I'll show you the numbers in a little bit, but I did 40 analyses, I had 40 ground motions, of which 4 of them caused collapse, or 10% of them caused collapse. And so in that case, I could say my observed probability of collapse at that IM level was 0.1. 10% of my ground motions caused a collapse. Okay, so I've got data of that type, and what I'd like to do, remember, is I'd like to do my parameter estimation. So I want to find my theta and my beta parameters to plug into this fragility function so that I can get a fragility function, like that continuous line in the plot, that's consistent with my data. And what maximum likelihood, the principle of maximum likelihood says, is we're going to find the theta and the beta that have the highest probability of having produced the observed data. Right? So if I think about superimposing back up on this figure, I could have a fragility function that looked something like this red one here and has much higher probabilities of collapse than that blue one. There's some possibility that that red fragility function could have produced my data. I could have had a 95% probability of collapse at an IM level of 1 and only observed 40% of my actual ground motions to cause collapse. It's possible, but it's pretty unlikely that that would happen. Whereas for my blue fragility function, since the probabilities of collapse are pretty similar to my observed fractions of collapse, that's a much more likely fragility function to have produced the observed data, and the principle of maximum likelihood would say that that blue function is therefore, representing a better set of parameter estimates than my red fragility function. Okay, so intuitively that makes a lot of sense. Let's look at kind of mathematically how we go about satisfying that objective. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to say if I've got n ground motions and n structural analyses, I have n observations of collapse or no collapse. So if one of those ground motions causes a collapse, it counts in that category. If it causes a no collapse, it's in the other category. Those are the only 2 outcomes. And then just for mathematical completeness, we have to assume that those observations are independent. So if I saw a collapse in the first ground motion, that doesn't influence my estimation of seeing a collapse in the second ground motion at the same IM level. That's a quite reasonable assumption. Okay, so if I have n observations of collapse or no collapse, and P sub j is the true probability that a ground motion at that intensity level would cause a collapse, then the probability that I would see a given number of collapses out of my n analyses is given by I have a binomial distribution. All right, this is the, back up. This is the distribution that tells us, for instance, if I'm flipping a fair coin that has a 50% probability of the heads, what's the probability that I see 4 heads out of 10 coin flips? Right, it's exactly the same math here, but instead of flipping a coin, I'm running a ground motion and seeing if I get a collapse or no collapse in my structure. Okay. This depends on the true probability of collapse, which I don't happen to know yet, right? Okay, and if that fragility function is a good model for what's going on with my structure, the probability of collapse of my structure at a given IM level is given by that fragility function. So I'm going to take that same equation from up above, and where I had a Pj, I'm going to substitute in the equation for my fragility function. Okay, so there's my fragility function, and then I had a Pj here. I got one more of these fragility functions. Okay. And I guess if we want to take a look at the functional form of this thing, right, if I have z collapses, I've got the probability of one ground motion causing a collapse is Pj. I'll raise that to the zth power. I observed, let's say I'm interested in 8 collapses, so I've got to think about probability of collapse times the probability of collapse times the probability of collapse 8 times for those. And then 1 minus Pj, that's my probability of no collapse. And all the rest of my analyses didn't have a collapse, so let's say I had 32 no collapses. So I'd take the probability of no collapse raised to the 32nd power to account for those. And then I've got this binomial coefficient out front that just accounts for the different orderings of, say, 40 analyses, all the different orderings that would result in 8 collapses and 32 non-collapses. Okay, so that's the functional form. It tells me how likely I would be to see a given number of collapses out of my analyses. Plug in my fragility function to get the probability of collapse. And that tells me this is the probability that I would see Z collapses out of N ground motions at a given IM level xj. Okay, but then my structural analysis, I'm going to do this at multiple IM levels. So if this is a probability at one IM level and I get a corresponding probability at another IM level, the probability of seeing both sets of those realizations is just going to be the product of the probabilities. Okay, so we'll take the product of the probabilities over each IM level. So that assumes, again, an independence assumption of collapse realizations. And that will give us this likelihood function where kind of the argument in here is exactly the terms that we had up in the previous equation. And then this big Greek letter pi here is indicating a product over all the IM levels. Okay, and then this overall thing we're going to call a likelihood. So that's the probability of having observed the data we observed for a given fragility function, right? So I have to specify a theta and a beta in order to compute this likelihood. So if I pick a theta and a beta, I can find this likelihood that's associated with the data I've observed. And then I could pick a different theta and a different beta and compute a different likelihood. And I'm going to think, over all the possible values of theta and beta, which one gives me the maximum value of this likelihood. Okay. So that's what we're doing here. So I just repeated the equation from the previous slide for us to remember. And so we're going to take this term here, this likelihood, and I'm going to put it into an optimization. Right? So I'm going to take that, and I'm going to say, let's go find the maximum value of that thing over all values of theta and beta. And whichever values of theta and beta give me the maximum value of this, those are going to be my parameter estimates, theta hat and beta hat. Okay? So that's actually a pretty straightforward calculation to do. If I have, so I'm searching for theta and beta. All I need to know is xj, what are the IM levels that I was looking at? nj, how many analyses did I do at each of those IM levels? And zj, how many collapses did I get at each of those IM levels? So if I specify those numbers, this optimization is very straightforward. And so to help illustrate this procedure, I've written up a couple versions of this. So there's a version in Microsoft Excel we'll look at in just a moment. And then I also wrote a version in MATLAB that will do this. And if you go to this URL, both sets of those scripts are provided, as well as some scripts and some software tools for some related calculations that are described in the paper. Okay, so let's take a look at the spreadsheet, the Excel version here, to see how this works. Okay, so this is the spreadsheet. I've rearranged the figure just slightly, or put this plot in a slightly different place than on the spreadsheet so that we can see everything in one screen here. But this is exactly the spreadsheet that's on that website that I listed. And here's how things work. Okay, so we've got to orient ourselves a little bit. So the gray fields here, this is what the user needs to specify in order to run this spreadsheet. Right? So this is the first column is the IM levels of interest. Those are the xj's in the previous equation we were just looking at. Then we need to specify nj, the number of analyses at each IM level. So in this case, there were 40 analyses performed at each of these IM levels. And then we need xj, the number of collapses at each of the IM levels. So at the first 3 IM levels, there were 0 collapses, then 4, 16, 4 all the way up onto 16. Okay, and then some of these are empty, but these could be filled in as well. Okay, so the gray areas, all the user has to specify. Then down here below, we've got our theta and our beta values that go along. This is our kind of initial guess for the fragility function, and we're going to vary those things in a minute. Right? And you can see there's some comments here that I've got hidden right now, but you can read those if you download the spreadsheet yourself to some reminders of how to use this thing. Okay, so what are the calculations we're going to do? So we are going to compute a couple things. So first I'm going to compute the fraction of the analyses causing collapse. So if I look at my formula, that's just going to be the number of collapses divided by the number of analyses. And I'm providing that. I don't need that directly, but I'm just going to use it to plot over on this spreadsheet here, or on this plot here. Right, so these blue diamonds here, those are plotting the IM level and then the fraction of analyses causing a collapse. So you can just see visually that's the data we're working with, and I want to fit a fragility function to that. Okay. And these are exactly the same numbers that were on the slides we were just looking at a moment ago. Okay. Then I have a black plot here, which is the fitted fragility function that's using these theta and beta parameters. So the formula is off screen here. We don't need to look at it, but I'll just show you that if I change the value of theta, that fragility function moves over to the right. So I made theta a little bit bigger. The fragility function moved a little bit to the right. Okay. Put that back for a moment. Okay. So there's the observed fraction causing collapse. My theoretical fragility function, that's just the values of the black function evaluated at the particular IM level of interest. So if I look at this formula, I'm taking my normal cumulative distribution function, I'm plugging in the log of the IM value that I'm interested in, and then I'm specifying the theta and the beta values here. So this is just mathematically computing my fragility function. And we can see here, for instance, if I pick the IM level of 0.4, I observed 0 collapses, so my fraction of collapses is 0. My fragility function, as of right now, says there's an 8% probability of collapse at this IM level. So I'm a little bit off here, but that's okay. Okay, so that's my fragility function. And now I'm going to go compute that likelihood that we were looking at in the previous slide. So I told you that was the binomial distribution PDF. So I'm taking the binomial distribution and I'm plugging in the fragility function for my PJ. I'm plugging in the number of collapses for my ZJ. So I guess the argument is the number of analyses first. Sorry. So B16, we're specifying the number of trials, the NJ, and then the probability. I think I mixed that up. Okay, so we're specifying the number of successes. C16 is the number of collapses. B16, I'm specifying the number of trials. And E16, we're specifying the PJ, the probability of collapse. Okay. So this is just a built-in Excel function that does exactly that binomial distribution equation from the slides. Okay, so we can take let me move this down for just a second. What I'm interested in doing is computing the product of all those likelihoods, right? So let's take a product of my likelihoods. So this is the big sigma notation. We're taking the product over all the different IM levels, and I get this likelihood here. This is telling me kind of the probability that I would observe that data. It's a very small number, right? Basically saying, it's very unlikely that I would have only observed 40% collapses at IM of 1 when if the true fragility function was giving me a probability of collapse of 0.7, for example. Okay, so I want to make that number as big as possible. It turns out a numerical trick for optimizing this is to take the logarithm of these likelihoods. So I'll just take the logarithm of that likelihood, and then the logarithm of the product is equal to the sum of the individual logarithms. So this cell right here is taking the sum of the log likelihoods, and whatever choice of theta and beta can maximize this sum is also the theta and beta that would maximize this product. And that product is a little numerically more unstable, so it turns out to be a little easier if we just maximize this log likelihood instead. Okay? Gives us exactly the same answer. Okay, so now let's look as I vary this theta and the beta. Let me change this back again. So we had a theta of 0.8, and I can see that my fragility function is giving me too big a probability of collapses for a given x. So let me make that theta a little bit bigger, make it a 1, and I scoot this fragility function over. And remember, just a moment ago, I had kind of zeros for my likelihoods at these high IO levels, and now I have non-zero saying, okay, well, for this fragility function, it's more likely that I would have actually observed that data. And if I move it a little bit bigger still, those likelihoods get even a little bit bigger. Okay, so I could move this theta around myself and try to find the theta value that gives me the best likelihood. But Excel, and computers in general are very good at doing these optimizations for us. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to Data, and we'll click on Solver. Now, if your Solver button's not here, you may have to go over and enable an add-in in Excel to have that Solver button show up. But if you Google Solver in Excel, you'll find the steps for how to do that. Okay, so what Solver is going to give us an option here. And it's kind of pre-populated in the Excel spreadsheet that you'll look at, just like this. So what it's saying is, I'm going to set my objective, which is the sum of my log likelihoods. Okay, so I'm going to take cell G30, my my sum of my log likelihoods, and I want to make that as big as possible. So I'm going to set it to the maximum, and the way I'm going to make it big is by changing cells C28 and C29, which are the theta and betas. So it's saying give me as big of a log likelihood as possible for any values of theta and beta. Okay, and then there's some constraints. These cells are already pre-named, but this is basically saying that the theta and the beta need to be bigger than 0. Just to keep some numerical stability. We don't want to have any negative values showing up in either of those. It would cause some kind of numerical problems. So we'll just put some limits on those, and then we can click solve. And it's going to try all the different thetas and betas through an optimization scheme. I'll keep my solver solution. And what I see is I got to a theta of 1.08, which is kind of around the 1.1 where we had seen a good fit. I see my fragility function passes nicely through that data. And of all possible values of theta and beta, this one gives me the highest values of these likelihoods of observing the data we observed. Okay, so that's how this spreadsheet works. You just have to click solver, dropping in whatever data you want, and you'll get the fragility function fitted here. All right, and exactly the same numerical routine is also implemented in that. Okay, so back to our slides. That's how we solve this equation to get the maximum value out of this log likelihood, or out of this likelihood function, or equivalently the log likelihood. Okay, one other note is there's other ways to fit likelihood or fit fragility functions through data. And just to mention briefly, the literature from statistics says that maximum likelihood estimators, this is a general class of estimator that we've used here, they have a lot of very desirable properties in terms of kind of maximizing the value of the data, and if you have an infinite amount of data, kind of heading towards a perfect estimation of your parameters and things like that. And so these maximum likelihood procedures are very widely used in statistical applications, and you can make a mathematical argument that this is clearly the appropriate approach to use in fitting this type of data. All right, and so not only is this a good choice that's kind of well-grounded in statistical theory, but it's actually better performing than other alternatives. So an alternative strategy that is sometimes used for fitting these fragility functions is to say, let's think about all the different theta and beta values, and for a given fragility function that's specified by a theta and beta, let me look at the difference between my observed fraction of collapses and my predicted probability of collapse. And so that would be kind of my error for this particular data point. I could square those errors and add them all up. So sum of squared errors is a kind of a criterion, and I could minimize that sum of squared errors. If I do that, I get this red function for my fragility function fit. So I actually get a different set of parameters. That's the first interesting thing to note. It doesn't give me the same answer, but it also demonstrably gives me a worse answer because it's not utilizing our knowledge of the properties of this data. So for instance, the easy intuitive way to think about the difference in this case is that down at this IM level of 0.4, I had 40 analyses and not a single one of them caused a collapse. So the maximum likelihood method knows that for any kind of non-zero collapse fragility function, it would be extremely unlikely to see 0 out of 40 ground motions cause a collapse. And so the maximum likelihood function stays very close to 0 probabilities of collapse down here. The sum of squared errors estimator just is looking at the distance between the observed fraction of collapse and the predicted probability of collapse. And that distance is just as bad if it occurs here as if it occurs over kind of more centrally in the data. Whereas the maximum likelihood method knows that kind of seeing 0 out of 40 collapses is a very strong indicator of small probabilities of collapse. Whereas kind of seeing 40% collapses, seeing 16 out of 40 collapses in this particular data point, there's a range of fragility functions that could be somewhat consistent with that. And so the maximum likelihood estimator is taking a better advantage of our knowledge of the type of data we're working with here. So kind of demonstrably better from a statistical perspective to be using this proposed procedure over, say, the sum of squared errors or some other alternative procedure. So if this is a statistically rigorous procedure, it's easy to implement. It's actually already implemented for you if you'd like to use one of my tools. And there's been a number of other researchers who've used this approach in past years as well. Those other researchers are referenced in the paper that I have it's the companion to this presentation. So this is not the first time this argument has been made, but I wanted to take the time to explain what's the thinking behind this procedure and to provide some easy to use tools so that others can take advantage of this maximum likelihood procedure. Okay, so to wrap things up, this maximum likelihood estimation technique This is the statistically rigorous method for fitting collapsed fragility functions. And remember, we came into this thinking about kind of the multiple stripe analysis method of collecting data, as opposed to, say, an incremental dynamic analysis method. So in this particular situation, this is the appropriate way to do it. The technique is relatively straightforward. We walked through it in a couple slides, and it's easily implemented in any sort of software package you'd like, because all you need is a simple optimization, and that's implemented in a number of different software tools. It's already provided for you in MATLAB and Excel at this URL that's noted here. And just to give you a little foreshadowing for the paper, and the paper, the information is noted here down below again. Google search will point you to that paper pretty quickly. Once we have this approach for fitting, the paper provides also kind of a systematic study to say, well, if I can fit data from any sort of kind of collection of structural analyses, how should I perform those structural analyses? How many analyses should I do? At what IM levels should I perform them, so that I can kind of quickly get to a good estimate of my theta and beta, and quickly get to a good estimate of a fragility function. So you can see more details providing the background for that approach, and providing some of the results indicating what some effective strategies are for doing structural analysis with these insights. Okay, so I hope this video has been a useful overview as a companion to that paper, and I hope the software tools will get you started utilizing this procedure, and that you'll be able to make some use of it in your own work. Thank you.